Paul, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you again for being here.
All right, thank you, John, and I will open us with a prayer, and as I mentioned last week, I will not have a closing prayer so that we won't be, if any of you need to get up to leave to make church service or something, you feel free to do so. I had a copy attached to your notes of the opening prayer, and I'm going to pick up some ways down into the body of the prayer and not the whole thing. Dear God, our thankfulness today is that in your Son you have provided us a light, a comforter, and a beacon of hope. Your word tells us that in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Just as Jesus comforted Mary and Martha in their sorrow and comforted his disciples by promising that he would not leave them, we are promised that we can also have this assurance that we will never be abandoned or forsaken. That even today, 2,000 years later, that light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not been able to overcome it. Amen.
Amen.
I see some, thank you for coming, and thank you, there's so many new faces this week, and so as a matter of sort of maybe setting the preliminary of sort of how my classes go, it's sort of a format, and some people refer to it as a lecture format. Well, I'm not a lecturer. I am sort of a bearer of information that I have gathered. Call me a sort of a literary clerk. I think it would be better than the term lecturer. But we talked about last week 7 real good books on the historical Jesus that I discussed in some length, and everyone that's here today, I wish you would be sure that your name is in this little notebook and your email address, because I would like to send you the notes from last week so that you can catch up on where we are, especially relative to some of this source material. These were some books that I mentioned last week are real good sources for a study of the historical Jesus. I would recommend every single one of them. I had several of them. There were a couple of them that I had, when I was starting to prepare for this class, that I had not read. The first 2, the Schweitzer book, I had never really read. It's quite extensive in the book by John Dominic Crossan. The rest of them I had read. The 2 that I recommend the highest are the 2 by E.P. Saunders, the 2 at the bottom, and the Jesus of Nazareth book by Paula Fredrickson. These 2 are very accessible to us, laymen, to read it in a way that you really understand it. And there was one book that I did not read in preparation. I started working on this class about 5 months ago. There was one book I wanted to read. I did not ever get around to reading it. And Robert Mims would be the person that would know why I did not read that book. And it was because the cheapest copy I could find was $115. So that's the John Meyer book, who is a professor of history and religion at Notre Dame, and he's excellent. But $115, I said, I'll just go with these. And it's sort of, as I should have mentioned this last week, but sort of the way I approach my classes is I try to prepare material over a course of period of time in notes, and read as much as I can and gather material over several months and compile it into how many ever weeks that we're trying to teach the class in, and set up a series of notes that way. We're not oriented toward a great deal of discussion, because I think we're all in here to learn. I know I am, and anyone who teaches these classes will always tell you they learn a lot more than anybody in the class learns. So it's sort of it's not oriented toward discussion. I remember one time Pastor Hall was teaching the class on James, the book of James, and just as he got started, the very first day, it started to deteriorate into who wrote the book of James. And so somebody spoke up and said, well, there's a lot of Jameses in the Bible. It could have been any one of 4 or 5 different Jameses. And somebody else said, well, it couldn't have been James because Josephus says that James the Sanhedrin tried him and they took him out and stoned him to death. And this was been in 62 AD, so he wouldn't have written it. And then somebody else just started to say something, and Pastor said, oh, he said, let's just agree that we don't know who wrote it. Let's just talk about what's in it. What he said is what's important. So we went on from there. And so it's not, all of you here could be doing something else besides being here this morning. And Graham could be over getting a latte at Bay Brew. So I'll try to go through as much of this material as I can, but the main thing are the notes. Take those notes with you, and if you have time, read them. And last week's notes, and what you'll end up with is sort of a 4-week summary of all of this information that I've been able to gather. And I hope that other people will use it. Now, if I have a lot of other classes that if you would like the notes to, I would be welcome to send them to you, be glad to send them to you. If you would like notes on any other class that I've ever taught. Some other people that are teaching Sunday school somewhere else, I've had people email me and say, could I have your notes on Bonhoeffer? Could I have your notes on Kierkegaard? So there's no need, it's not Paul Clark's notes, it's just stuff that I've gathered, information, and put together in the form of notes. So make use of that as much as you can, or as much as you would like to. I had someone recently ask for my Kierkegaard notes because that teaches at another church. And that's because there was no need of them going back and reassembling all that. So look at it that way and ask me for anything that you might find that might be of interest to you. But having said all that, I do encourage that you will email me with any comments or questions that you have. My email address is right up there. I appreciate all the good emails that I got this week. A lot, so many of you. Are we out of copies?
Yes, sir.
If we aren't,
We are.
if we could maybe get someone to, Donald give up hers because I can get her one when we get home.
I think
I'm sorry.
Does everybody have one? Does everybody have?
I'm sorry.
Everyone at least see one? Okay. Thank you.
You know, so I wanted to mention that. I know most of you have been to my classes before, and so you sort of know the format. I think Kim has been to every single class that I've ever taught. So when she walked in here last week, she knew what the drill was, and she knew how it was going to go. So I want to recap just a little bit, because one of the things that you're required to do when you talk about the historical Jesus is to establish some sort of a context in which Jesus lived, the times, the political atmosphere, the social atmosphere in which Jesus lived, the religious atmosphere. What was it like in Jesus' time to be an observant Jew, as Jesus was? What did that involve, and what did it involve for the other people that lived in Palestine during a time when it was occupied by a foreign country and under the rule of a foreign country? What are the implications of all this? So understanding some of that sets the stage for coming up with a few facts that we may be able to reasonably ascertain about the historical life of Jesus. And E.P. Saunders, whose book has visited most of the doctor's offices and blood where you have your blood tested, blood labs is what I'm trying to think of. This has been around for the last 3 or 4 months, and these nurses are probably used to seeing this picture of Jesus as I sit there waiting for them to draw my blood. But Saunders mentions that one of the problems in his book, he mentions that one of the problems of trying to talk about the historical Jesus is that we all already have our ideas about Jesus and who he was probably a lot about what he did. So it makes it a little bit difficult for these scholars to write about something that people already know a lot about and have opinions on. And as Sandra says, a lot of times what people want to hear is what they already sort of think. They've already formed their opinion about things, so they're looking for a book or some information that sort of verifies where they already were coming from. But he says that even though he is a ordained Methodist pastor, with one hat, as a scholar, he has to put on another hat and say, look, I've got to look at this objectively. So he says you have to subject all of this to some sort of scrutiny, and he said, he's sort of not. You have to look at it not from a certain perspective, but objectively. So he says the historian has an obligation to subject his sources to cross-examination. So that's when he does, and that's where the whole subject of literary criticism and particularly biblical criticism comes into play. Is what is it's not to say this happened or that happened with any specificity as much as it is say what may likely happen, and so a lot of times what likely happened can be supported more by multiple attestation. In other words, the more sources that you have that say that something happened, the more likely it is to be something that factually happened. And that's why the writings of the documentation of some of the non-biblical sources that we have for the historical life of Jesus are so important. If we say and if we read in the Bible that certain thing happened, but Josephus, the Jewish historian turned Roman historian, if he never said anything about it in all of his writings, which he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes, sometimes at one time I thought I was going to read Josephus' work. It turns out it's 20 huge volumes of work. I'm not approaching even trying to read that. So, but if he doesn't mention it, well, it doesn't have quite the credibility that would be if it is something that he did mention and talk about. So this multiple attestation is an important part of literary criticism. It's for people like A.P. Saunders and others who write about this stuff. How many sources do we have? And that's why we'll talk about a little bit later today the Q Gospel, because if three books of the Bible, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke all say the same thing, but it all came from one source. They all sort of, and we'll see some of that today. Then that doesn't count as three different people saying three different things. It counts as one person saying something. So I mentioned in the notes, and if you have an interest, you can explore these notes later. But information about the historical Jesus it doesn't seem to be very much available. But on closer examination, it's probably as much available about the historical Jesus as there is about many historical figures that lived during that time, during that era. There's nothing that Jesus wrote that survived if he indeed wrote anything. And there's nothing that anyone that was a close associate of Jesus wrote that has survived if there was anything. So we're relying on things that were written in some cases many decades after his life. But to scholars, it's very important to talk about the relevance of the time that things were written about Jesus as to the time that he actually lived. A few decades makes a lot of difference. For example, the book that I turn to more in thinking about the life of of Jesus may not be the book that is considered to have the most information, but it may be the oldest book and the one that was written first. So I was move on to talk about some of the earlier sources. You would think that the Apostle Paul would be one of the real early sources for information about the life of Jesus, because Paul lived. He lived at the same time that Jesus lived. I think within just a decade or so of Jesus' life, Paul comes along. But really, it turns out that this seems like it's going to be a great source of information about the historical life of Jesus, but it doesn't turn out to be all that much at first glance, because Paul doesn't seem to say much about Jesus. His letters are intended for a specific audience of churches that he has visited. He's following up with more information back to those churches. If they're having problems, he's trying to give them information that would solve these problems or address these problems. And the second reason is that Paul was himself not converted to Christianity during the time of Jesus' life. So he would have not been someone that would have known Jesus or had any association with him. So he knew of him as a historical person, but he does mention some things about Jesus in his writing. I'm talking about Paul now as being what we would like to think of as a real early primary source of information about Jesus. It would be great. His writings are earlier than much of the other information that we're going to have to rely on. He knew of Jesus as a historical person, of course. He mentioned that Jesus was born. He mentioned that he was a Jew. He mentioned that he was a direct descendant of King David, that he had brothers. He mentioned that one of his brothers was named James. He knows that Jesus conducted a ministry among the Jews, that he had 12 disciples. He knows that he was a teacher, and that he knows that Jesus anticipated his own death. He knew that Jesus had a Last Supper on the night that he was handed over, and that he was killed at the instigation of Jews in Judea. And he knows that he died by crucifixion. So we at first we don't think we get much information from Paul, but we get quite a bit, because it's the timeliness of it shows that at what point in time people were beginning to realize things about Jesus. I mentioned the idea about multiple and triple attestation, and I want to move on in my notes to talk about something that I mentioned last week that is called a source of information. It's called the Q Gospel, which is, and I don't want to spend a lot of time with this because we have so much material to cover, but it gets back to what I was talking about. Scholars, the more sources they have, and the earlier those sources are, the more credibility the information has. So, and that's why Paul would be so important, because his information is earlier information. And so the multiple attestation part of it is the more sources that speak to this, the more apt it is to be factual information. I gave an example, I think, last week of the fact that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. It is attested to in several places in the Bible, and is even attested to in extra Bible sources outside the Bible, beyond the Bible. And so that it can be given more credibility, for example, as being something that factually happened, than perhaps something that is only attested to by one gospel and not anywhere else, and especially something that that historically probably would have been attested to by one of the non-biblical historians, if it had actually happened. Not to say that it didn't happen, but the way scholars work with this information is what is more likely. They don't say that Mary and Joseph didn't take Jesus away as an infant to Egypt to hide him, to keep Herod from coming in seeking out all the children. They're just saying that since it's attested to in only one place in the Bible, not by other places and not by other gospels, and since that it likely would have been something that some of the Roman historians would have said something about, it doesn't gain the credibility that something else might gain that is attested to in several places and by some of the historians of the era, if that makes any sense. Moving on through my notes today, and let me say something about these notes. I'm in a sort of a inept way of trying to cover some of these notes, but the notes really are what I think is important for you all as you have a chance to read them, because I'm trying to put in writing a lot of material that I skip over or forget about or don't mention when I discuss it in class. So if you have time to read these notes, do so. And think of me as just the sort of the gatherer of the information and putting it and assembling it for you, and so that we can have it to look at. And I've often hoped that I'll try to put it in week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4 like that, so that it can be used later. And thankfully, I've had some other people in other churches that have written me, can I have your notes on Kierkegaard? I'm getting ready to teach a class on Kierkegaard. Well, of course, there's no need of you going back and, reassembling all of that and putting it down when you can just use mine. And they're not Paul Clark's notes. They're just notes that I've extracted from sources and can be used by anyone. So sort of think of it in that way, that the notes sort of stand on their own. I may hit the highlights, I may miss some things, but read them if you get a chance. What happened last week is we just didn't get very far, and so I had a lot of notes left over from last week that I didn't get to, and we'll have to sort of pick up, and that's why your notes are as you have them, are sort of in 2 sections. One section is left over from last week, and another section is the section that I hope to start to get to today. And as I mentioned, the classes that I've led over the years have been more of a, like I said before, sort of a lecture type class, and not conducive to a lot of questions and answers or discussion, because I apologize for that, because I enjoy those kinds of classes myself. I enjoy the kind of classes that we break off into small groups and discuss something, then we come back and sort of report what our group thought. Those are wonderful, and we had one recently, and I've known Keith Maurer here for years, but we've just known to say hi and in passing, and hello, how are you? We've never really known him, so it ended up we were sitting beside each other, and so we happened to be the 2 people that were supposed to discuss this one thing that John Ryder was talking about. Well, gee, what a blessing that was to me, because I got to know Keith on a level that I hadn't known him before. And what he said was so interesting to me. And I went home and I told Don, I said, guess what Keith Maurer was talking to me about today? and so I have a real love for that kind of format. And when I'm done here in 4 weeks, maybe the next class that we have will be back to that kind of format. But I'm just going to struggle along and try to go through as many of these notes as I can. But I encourage you to read them, save them as a sort of a corpus of information on this, and you can pass them on to someone else that you think may be interested. I listed some things that I'm going to go over very hurriedly today, but they'll be in your notes. I list what I consider to be the earliest New Testament non-canonical and canonical sources that might be used in some way to establish the historic of Jesus. And I put them in your notes, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. Dating books of the Bible and New Testament as to when these books were written is a very dicey and very troublesome task for scholars. It's hard to tell. There are no original books of any of these the New Testament. There's no book out there marked that somebody can go look at and say, well, what kind of paper is this written on? And maybe we can tell when it was written. They don't exist. So there's never been an original copy of any of these books found. There's never been a copy of a copy found. Usually what they start out is they start finding fragments of some of these books that go back to maybe 150 or so years after they were written. And then maybe you get on into maybe the 3rd century and you start finding pretty much a whole book of some of these books. So it's very difficult for scholars to determine when books of the Bible were written, particularly like for the New Testament books that we'll be talking about. They have clues that we might not think of. Obviously, if you look at a document and that document portrays something that happened historically in the document, then you know that it must be written after that event happened. So there's some sort of obvious things like that they can go by. If a New Testament book mentions the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, of the Second Jewish temple, well, you know that it must be written after that event happened, or it would not be in the book. So there are techniques that they can use to sort of gauge approximately when these books were written. And then it's like in the books that we'll mostly be talking about, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are ways that they can sort of surmise that Mark was the first and that Matthew and Luke came later, and that they used Mark as a source for their book. And you know, I sometimes use the term scholars think or scholars, and I don't do that casually. I don't say scholars think it unless I think that's what scholars think. And when I say a majority of scholars, I don't mean 51%. You know, when I say that scholars do not know who wrote the book of Mark or feel like they do, the majority of scholars, I'm talking about 95%. I'm not talking about 51%. So I don't just toss those things, scholars think, or scholars feel like out without really saying, is this really what scholars think? If I think that scholarship is divided on something, I will say that I think scholarship is divided on it. And there are a lot of things that's the case, that there are certain scholars that feel that are in a minority but feel very strongly. I mentioned last week, there are scholars out here now that are speaking on college campuses that are making a case that Jesus did not exist as a human being, that he existed only as a spiritual character, and that he's a mythological figure in terms of actually living a human life on earth. And there's one name, Richard or Robert Price, Chuck would know, but and some but that makes a living going from college campuses making that case. So so we have to sort of say what the majority. There's always a minority. There's always someone that feels, oh no, that's not right. It's something else. So there's no way to know exactly when these gospels were written, but there are techniques that they can use to sort of determine what the best guess would be as to when they were written. If one's using material from another, it's obvious that the one is earlier than the other, that sort of thing. And then too, one of the things that's and I'm digressing a little bit, but one of the things that scholars use to determine the age of these gospels is the aging of the theology that's contained in them. You can see the progression of the theology as you go through these gospels. the contrast between the book of Mark and the book of John, for example. When Mark, and that's why Mark, I'll probably say this a few times, Mark is by far my favorite book of the Bible, my favorite gospel, because it is early, and not just because it's the earliest, and maybe earliest by 2 or 3 decades before any of the other gospels, but because it presents a gospel and a series of historical facts and all before they have been acclimated to the conditions that are starting to exist, before Christianity has taken hold and become a primarily Gentile religion, not a Jewish religion, a Gentile religion. And the book of John, for example, many people say, oh, John's my favorite book. But it presents a Jesus that is a mature Jesus, not a Jesus that was born in a manger in Bethlehem, but a Jesus that's always existed. He's existed since the beginning of time and so forth. But that's okay, because that's the way that theology matured over the decades in the early Christianity. So there are no, and I try to not spend a lot of time on things that really, because we're in here to talk about the historical Jesus and not to spend too much time by digressing, although that's my tendency. There's one sheet in your notes that I do want to just mention briefly, that in the significance of it, it has to do with this whole idea of multiple attestation. What the scholars think, the more people that tell about something independent of each other, the more likely that is to be true. And I think we would all agree with that. If we run into somebody out here that says there was a big wreck on the expressway this morning, and we run into somebody down a block away, or around the church, or the corner church, and they said there was, well, maybe they told each other, and one of them is now telling you. So that maybe is not multiple attestation. But if we then go to the grocery store, and we someone that hasn't been around, and they say, oh, there was a big wreck on the expressway, yeah, now we're getting somewhere, So we're starting to now say, well, I bet there was a big wreck. So this sheet right here in your notes is sort of an important sheet, and I ask you to spend some time on it, because in this area of multiple attestation, what this sheet is all about is that it gives you an idea of how the information in one gospel was used by the writers of other gospels. And in this case, particularly, the book of Mark being maybe 20 or 30 years older than the books that came along after it, Luke and Matthew, that the information that Mark has gathered is going to be used by these other scholars. Nothing wrong with that. That's fine. That's good. But it has to do with this idea of, as it relates to what we're talking about, the historical Jesus, it has to do with the multiple attestation feature. If we look at this chart, we'll see that 76% of the entire book of Mark, Gospel of Mark, is repeated in Luke and Matthew. And it's the same information. Luke has the same information in that Matthew has, that it has been obviously, or I say apparently. Now here again, there are scholars out there say, oh no, this is all wrong. Matthew was the first gospel, but they are going to be in a very, very, very minority. And so we're talking about this multiple attestation factor, that a lot of the information in Mark is repeated in Luke and Matthew. And if you look at your notes on page 9, you'll see examples of this. You'll see an example of what they call Markan priority, and it's called the triple tradition. It is where that information that was in one gospel was repeated almost verbatim in some cases in other gospels. And so then, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's not too relevant to what we're talking about, except in that one regard, the multiple attestation factor. So I'll also mention, I mentioned briefly last week, that scholars think there is a lost gospel, and it's referred to as the Q gospel, a lost gospel that has never been found, that was used as a source for a lot of what is in some of the other gospels, Matthew and Luke, for example. And if you look on page 10, you'll see an example of that. You'll see an example of something that's almost verbatim repeated in the book, in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. But so you say, well, where did this come from? They're both saying exactly the same thing, but it's not in the book of Mark. So where did it come from? Well, long ago, the scholars have surmised that there is a book that has never been found, and they refer to it as the Q gospel, which is a German word that I think it's pronounced Quelle, Quelle, which just means source. I think it translates to the word source. So that's all we need to say about that, is that when we're talking about scholars feeling that what likely happened in Jesus' life, historical life, or how likely something was to have happened or not, they take into consideration how many people said this independent of each other. And so if we quote a Bible verse and we say that, it says that in Matthew and Mark and Luke, all three of the synoptic gospels, well, maybe it does, but maybe they all got it from the same place. So that's the only point that wanted to make there. Now I want to move on and talk a little bit about the Gospel of Mark. And as I said, or if I didn't say it, I will say it, that the author of these gospels are unknown. There traditionally have come down that a certain person wrote a certain book of the Bible. There may be some instances where that is true. I'm sure there is. But for the most part, later scholarship has said, we really don't know who wrote these books. They were probably written, the time that they think they were written is sort of creeping up later and later and getting later. And so they say it's just not practical. And there are many reasons that they feel that some of the authors that maybe that some of these gospels were originally attributed to, that really is not, it's not likely that two fishermen that Jesus recruited that were out seining for fish, that they ended up a few years later writing something in Greek that was as sophisticated theology-wise as some of these gospels are. And so there are many reasons for all that. But those, and I used to get hung up on this. Years ago, I'd get all excited about it, and particularly reading Bart Ehrman's books, and he loves to bring up things like this and sort of grind you into, did you realize this? I'm about 20 years past any of that, because what I have realized is that if they started all over, and we started all over with these Gospels, the 27 books of the New Testament, for example, I think for the most part, maybe with one or two exceptions, and many of us would have an idea as to what those exceptions should be, I think for the most part, they would be the same 27 books that we have. That they were there, because one of the criteria was which are the earliest, which are the ones that have traditionally been used more and passed down more as being the authentic books. And I don't think that has really changed a lot. So I don't think that scholarship, as much as it has accomplished, has concluded that any of these books like I get a quick example in the books of Paul. There were books in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul that now scholarship says they're not probably written by Paul. The books that are the pastoral part of Paul, where he's writing not to congregations that he has evangelized, but to other pastors that are leading churches. So the church has matured more. Now it has pastors that are over these, and he's writing these letters. Well, those were books that now scholars think were written by followers of Paul, not Paul himself. And there are ways that they can tell this, that are way beyond what we need to discuss here. But if there's terminology used in a certain book that Paul had never used before, certain words used, I use in another class, if one book of the Bible that's attributed to one author and another book attributed to that author, and the second book uses the term au contraire, and he uses it 16 times, but he didn't use it at all in the first book, and maybe he didn't write that second book. So that's the kind of thing that, but the longer I've dealt with this kind of thing in my mind, the less and less important it has become to me. And, you know, for somebody, oh, did you guess there's a contradiction here or there? And I mentioned a couple last week. You know, we said in our prayer today, it stood the test of time. 2,000 years later, the light still shines. It shines as bright as it ever did before. That's the important part. Whether or not who wrote this book of the Bible, whether it's a studiographic work or whether it was really written by, those are interesting things to talk about, but they don't really cut to the chase as to what's important, especially in our lives. So that's my problem of digressing and taking up our time. The Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel according to most scholars, and somewhere around 70 AD. There may be arguments, as I said before, for more or less years more beyond or before that. It was not written by anyone that was an eyewitness to the historical Jesus' life, but maybe written by someone that had access to information that was provided by an eyewitness. Mark is, as I say, my very favorite gospel. It cuts to the chase. It doesn't mess around. It doesn't make a lot of it. It doesn't say something and then try to explain it for a long. It just tells you the facts. The term that scholars use for this is pericope. Is that maybe a lot more of you all are familiar with that term than I am, but pericopes are what scholars think are the tiny little individual stories that went around about Jesus and before his life that were gathered together by these scholars to formulate these gospels. A pericope is and there I copied down and put in my notes all of the pericopes that are there are 108 pericopes in the book of Mark. That means there are 108 individual little things that the writer of the book of Mark is trying to tie together in the form of a gospel. The parable of the sower, the candle under a bushel, the parable of the seed growing secretly, parable of the mustard seed. If he's using parables, he's using healings, or he's using exorcism, he's using some wisdom or compassion that Jesus is showing up. These are little things that some of them may have been in writing, some of them may have just been passed down orally. But the writer of Mark has gathered these 108 little pericopes and formed a gospel out of them. And whoever wrote Mark is a masterful person. And we all, we're not, I don't dare digress into whether or not whether these writers were inspired or not. I think the writer of Mark, whether or not he was inspired, he certainly was a gifted writer because and he has a technique that is wonderful if you read. He uses the word immediately over and over and over again. I think 42 times in the book of Mark, he will say immediately, because he's trying to keep a pace. Things are moving along. He's not stopping to explain it. He's saying Jesus did this, and then immediately, and so it probably was some length of time between some of these things, but to Mark, we're going to keep going here. And when he if he needed the Pharisees to be there, they were there. If it would say immediately Jesus did so-and-so and the Pharisees said so-and-so. So he always can appropriate whatever he needs to tell the story that he's telling. So it's I think a great book, and I think I put in my notes that one of the things in textual criticism and people, these scholars, one of the things that they really look for is they look for the willingness to be self-critical. Are they willing to tell something that Jesus did that would normally not be something that would be giving him a lot of credit, but might even be an embarrassment to him? Or if you get over to the book of John, you're not going to see a lot of that. But in Mark, you will. You'll see that Mark, he has no problem saying that unfavorable and unflattering things about Jesus. He says he says that he's often misunderstood, that he argues about who is the greatest. They get angry with two disciples, argue among themselves. That some of the disciples ultimately abandoned Jesus, and he tells about Peter denying Jesus 3 times. So a lot of what Mark will say about Jesus are not things that are intended to glorify him. Don't tell me we're out of time, and I'm only on page 3 of it. So I've got to get my act together. Okay, so let me just say that when Mark makes extraordinary claims about Jesus' activities, his lack of intentionally covering up failures and shortcomings lend credibility to in the view of scholars. And to give you the extent, like that these scholars go to, and some people devote their whole lives to this. These scholars, and I admire them greatly. But there was one scholar I was reading about. He says he would say this, and to tell you the depth that they go to. Maybe who wrote this book? He says Mark's gospel is written in Greek. Its language fits in with the idea that it was written in Rome. The Latin word speculator is used for the executioner in Mark 6:27. The Latin word for centurio occurs and used rather than the Greek word for centurion. A Latin name is also given for a coin, which is called the quadrans. The author knows that he knows Palestine sufficiently that he can quote a number of words in Aramaic. You know, in Mark, there's what Jesus said when he was being crucified is in Aramaic. And so he knows Aramaic. And so these are the kinds of meticulous details that scholars go into to figure all this stuff out. Are we out of time, John?
Yes, sir.
Oh, boy. Okay.
He didn't even hesitate in responding to it.
So this will be continued at 2902 West Waverly Avenue. Just before the Bucks game. Thank you all. And we'll pick up next week.
Good job, Pauline. I like your fur. It's aggressive. No, I don't.
Do you have